Hi there. Again, my name is Megan Peterson. Please excuse my slow gait. I broke my knee 2 weeks ago, but we're still here. We're excited to be here, and thanks very much for the opportunity to come here. Just a little bit of background about me. I did my PhD research based in Juneau, Alaska, for 5 years on primarily killer whale depredation and to a lesser extent sperm whale depredation. And I'm currently doing a postdoc with NOAA Fisheries and working on this issue, more specifically how it affects the stock assessment. So been involved with this issue for a long time, and it's really excited to be here. So I'll be talking sort of about the counterpart to Jeff's presentation, and I'll be focusing on the sablefish fishery in western Alaska. And so just a little bit of basic life history on sablefish. Their distribution extends in the northeastern Pacific Ocean from northern Mexico through western Alaska. They typically stay in shallower waters as juveniles and then move offshore to deeper slope waters and become reproductively viable at about 4 to 5 years of age. And at that point, they're found at depths greater than 200 meters. And as Jeff mentioned, the fishery is primarily prosecuted at about depths greater than 600 meters. It's important to note that within these management areas, the sablefish move around quite a lot. So it's not, one stock per management area. There's a lot of movement, and so that affects the way the fishery is managed. So again, I'll be focusing on primarily the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands and the western Gulf of Alaska. And there are a lot of differences in the history of the western fishery, and then also in the way it's prosecuted now. So as Jeff mentioned briefly, folks were harvesting sablefish in Alaska as in the late 1800s, and it was actually a secondary target at that point to Pacific halibut. So it's been around for a while, but this was a really small fishery. And in western Alaska in the late 1950s, Japanese longliners came in and began harvesting sablefish in the Bering Sea. And during those years, they just actually hammered the Bering Sea sablefish fishery. It wasn't their primary target, but they were taking a ton of everything, and this has really affected the Bering Sea ecosystem. So these harvests from the foreign fisheries peaked in the 1970s, and in the early 1980s, as Jeff mentioned, there was the domestication of the fisheries, and it was fully domesticated by the United States in 1988 within the exclusive economic zone. And then, and again, in 1995, the IFQ system was implemented Alaska-wide. So again, you actually saw this figure. I'm just going to draw your attention to, can you see my cursor now? This thing. To the green and the red here at the bottom. And so red is Aleutian Islands, green is Bering Sea. And you can see here, this is when the Japanese longliners first came in, and they just completely hammered this area. And this is when the Soviet and Japanese longliners were hitting all of Alaska very hard. And then we have the domestication, peak of the domesticated fishery, and we're cruising along here currently. You'll note that there's a decline, especially in these western Alaska areas. And so the stock itself is in somewhat of a decline and has been lately. And this also sort of exacerbates the concern with depredation. What's the impact of depredation? That's always heightened when a stock is not doing very well. And this figure shows the total allowable catch and then the catches in just the recent years. And I want to illustrate here. So this is the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands in these lower two grids. And these fisheries are much smaller than what's taken in the Gulf of Alaska, about a fifth of that. So these are much smaller fisheries, less quota is harvested, fewer vessels are out here. It's also important to note, if for instance you look in 2014, these fisheries are not fully prosecuted. And that's a big difference as well. So in the Gulf of Alaska, they're pretty much hitting their tax. In Western Alaska, that's not the case. And there are a number of factors that influence that. Part of it, it's just trickier to get out there. The weather's less predictable. It's harder to catch fish. Killer whales are brutal, etc. So the kind of list goes on for why that's occurring, and it has been occurring for a number of years. Another important distinction between Western Alaska in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands and the rest of the Gulf is that there are three gear types allowed. So currently, pot gear is allowed for sablefish and longline gear, so that falls into this fixed gear category. Additionally, there is a sort of fixed amount of trawl incidental catch in this area. And the difference in the Gulf of Alaska, pot gear has traditionally not been allowed. And it's interesting to note, just in this last year, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which is our main regional fishery management body, has just voted to legalize pot fishing gear in the Gulf of Alaska. This is a big shift, and it was in large part due to sperm whale depredation. But I just wanted to draw your attention to pot fishing gear is a big component of the Western Alaska fisheries, and a lot of, again, this is probably due to killer whale depredation that we've seen that shift. So in Western Alaska, we're fishing, again, demersal longline. Sets average about 9 kilometers, 1.2 meter space between hooks. Another difference, vessels that are fishing out west tend to be larger. So if you just average the vessel size for Western Alaska vessels, it's about 95 feet, 30 meters or greater. Whereas if you look at the fleet as a whole, the average is 56 feet, 20 meters or so. And there are relatively more catcher processors. So you're just seeing bigger boats operating out west, processing their fish on board. And this is, there's farther steam times, so that kind of changes the demographics of the fishery out there. Since 2004, pot fishing has accounted for over 50% of the Bering Sea fixed gear catch and 34% of the Aleutian Islands fixed gear catch. And with this fishery, you're looking at, on average, 40 to 135 pots per set. And again, we have this incidental trawl catch that's fixed each year. So this figure shows vessel participation in the sablefish fleet over time. Again, let me draw your attention to these little bars in red and green. That is the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea. And this is 1995, is IFQ system is put in place. And then you can see that there has been some consolidation after this program was implemented. But again, Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands represent a small percentage of the fleet, and there aren't that many vessels operating out west, less than 100. So now I'm going to jump into depredation trends and sort of what we know and about the history. There are 3 main fisheries in Western Alaska that are actually affected by this interaction with using longline gear. So we have Pacific halibut, Greenland turbot, which is another flatfish, and then sablefish. And these are all damaged fish that a picture I took in the Bering Sea. This is actually a cool picture from a visitor paper where they were kind of caught in the act. And this figure here shows Alaska-wide, the NMFS longline survey stations. And so again, what I'm really focusing on is this zone of killer whale depredation. And so red triangle represents areas where killer whales hit stations, green squares where sperm whales have depredated. And there is some overlap. Sperm whales are in some cases moving farther west. Killer whale depredation occurs in the central Gulf. So this isn't fixed by any means, but it's a strong spatial trend that we see. That's really important to be aware of when we're looking at this statewide. With regards to data collection currently, we have 4 main sources, and Jeff spoke very well about the longline survey and how critical that is for sort of our understanding. It's an annual survey, everything is standardized, so we can look at time trends and other factors and get a really strong sense of what we're seeing on the survey. The survey is depredated by sperm whales and killer whales each year. We also have data from the commercial fishery, and this is different, so we only have partial observer coverage, and this is a trickier situation and data set to work with, that's for sure. But with both of these, with the longline survey and the commercial fishery, we're generally just tracking presence, absence of depredating whales and evidence of damaged fish. We don't have, for the most part, unless there's an independent study going on, there's not a separate person monitoring marine mammal depredation. It's generally these scientists and observers are there first to track the fish caught and then to track depredation if possible. We also do have logbook data. This is typically, the depredation sections are typically voluntary, filled out. I don't want to get too much into the details of this, but we have another agency called the International Pacific Halibut Commission that has been tracking depredation on their forms for a while, just in the most basic sense. The federal logbooks are actually moving in this next year to add a depredation section to this information. And so there's a proposed rule that will hopefully be going into place later this year. This would be a huge step because this would represent vessels that aren't being monitored by observers, which is the majority of the fleet. We might just get some basic depredation information out of that. So I hope that that will go through. And then, of course, we have some independent studies looking at depredation. So as part of my PhD, I was working with fishermen in 2013 and 14. We were collecting data on the fishing grounds. We did surveys. We did all sorts of stuff. We've done a lot of work looking at how depredation is impacting CPUEs, looking at depredation rates, what are whales targeting, and I'll talk about a lot more of that in future presentations. And of course, I want to mention Sea Swap as well. They're not just limited to Southeast Alaska. They're also collaborating with fishermen in the Central Bering Sea. And so they're also tracking and working on some of the issues out in Western Alaska as well. So I do want to just summarize sort of the frequency or percentage of sets that are impacted. And I'm going to show, we've looked at this from a number of different angles. And so looking at the survey and looking at averages by management area, on average, 9 to 50% of sets are impacted by killer whales on the longline survey. So, and then you average 25% overall. And it's important to note here that on the survey, they can't take evasive actions. So this represents, sort of in my mind, this is how often whales show up. The commercial fishery data, you'll see the averages are much lower, again, by management area, 6% average overall. And this represents perhaps the number fishermen are avoiding, just as we've heard in other presentations, they don't want to fish through killer whales. It's a terrible thing to do unless you have to. And so you'll see the commercial fishery depredated sets rate is much lower. For a number of reasons, I also think the observer data bias this low, and I'll talk about that further, that the values just don't represent the actual issue in some cases. We also did written surveys. Fishermen estimated 10 to 25% impacted, and data sheets on the fishing grounds about 10%. So we're seeing this range, 10 to 25% of sets impacted on average. So not as bad as perhaps the crozet with killer whales, but still this is a significant impact to any business model and to the survey itself. We've also looked at how depredation by killer whales is impacting catch rates, again from multiple sources. And so I'll just draw your attention to the sablefish value here. And we're looking at reductions. We get similar reductions on depredated sets for both the longline survey and the commercial fishery. So 45 to 72% CPUE reductions when killer whales are present. Fishermen reported similar reductions on their own through separate studies. So this shows what we think they're taking when depredating whales are present. I just wanted to include this one slide. This is from longline survey data, and this is where we estimated what the impact might be to the overall catch over time. And so you can see in the Bering Sea, which is typically where killer whale depredation is the worst, we estimated 30% of overall catch was removed on the survey. And then down the line, the Aleutian Islands, 24%, Western Gulf, 10%. And this is where depredation isn't quite as frequent in the Western Gulf. So with regards to mitigation currently, obviously we have sablefish pot gear. So far that has been effective at reducing depredation, but it can be an expensive transition for vessels. And also there's this question, is this shifting depredation pressure to other remaining longline vessels? Changing fishing behavior is pretty much the primary for longline. Drop your gear back down, move to a different site. But as we all know, that is quite costly for operations. And I'll also talk about this in more detail in a few presentations. And there have been acoustic deterrence. Orchosphere has been tested. Of course, bang pipes, seal bombs, questionably acoustic. But the efficacy of these devices is still in question. Additional avoidance measures that have been tried, and this is not, this may work temporarily, but nothing, no silver bullet here. Chaser skiffs, shorter sets, tandem fishing, and hauling quickly, of course, and staying in gear while hauling. So all these things have been tried out, but we don't have that, again, that perfect answer, that's for sure. And I don't know if I'm taking any questions, so I'll just end on that slide.